Hello, I am Imran Iqbal. I am presenting Project 3 in DBA 810 UMGC Spring 2020. Last week, Ms. May, our new CEO, shared her vision to bring about an organizational culture shift towards servant leadership. Ms. May was motivated by a 2010 article entitled Achieving High Organization Performance Through Servant Leadership by Melcho and Bosco. The article suggested that servant leadership helps sustain organizational performance in unstable environments. As a scholar practitioner, I prefer that an organizational shift be based on evidence-based approach. Therefore, I analyzed merits of servant leadership by evaluating that article and also by examining other studies on the subject. Here at the outset, I explained the notion of servant leadership in the introduction, an evidence-based management approach also in the introduction, and then present my analysis of the article and its comparison with an alternative article on the subject using preset criteria. I then present my conclusions and my recommendations on whether or not Brookshore should undergo a large-scale organizational culture shift. Servant leadership is regarded as a holistic approach through which leaders develop followers in many dimensions. Servant leaders serve others to help them grow as persons and become wiser, freer, and more autonomous in decision making. Servant leaders inspire employees to become servant leaders themselves. Following Greenleaf's servant leadership theory of 2002, scholars claim to recognize many specific traits of this theory. Pertinent are Barbuto and Wheeler's 5 factors: altruistic calling, emotional healing, wisdom, persuasive mapping, and organizational stewardship. Servant leadership became popular for 2 reasons. It represents a move away from command and control models, and it appears to be a reaction against corporate scandals of our times, rejecting centralized decisional structures. It has been recognized, for instance, by Melcher and Bosco in themselves, that servant leadership research must now move beyond explication of theory to measurements of its constructs. Evidence-based management approach encourages such measurements to be derived from real-world organizations and field practices. It also infuses managerial practices with principles and insights extracted from trustworthy and high-caliber scholarly research. To select an alternative article, the following 4 basic criteria were used: recency, author's areas of expertise, quantitative analysis, and evidence-based management approach. The bibliographic research employed citation searching, reference list checking, and snowballing. I used digital databases. UMGC's OneSearch led to ABI Inform, Business Source Complete, JSTOR, and Scopus. Initial returns were 7,773. Through an iterative process of finding, choosing, note-taking, deciding to keep, rejecting right away or later, and repeating with different terms or databases, I located 5 articles. I then narrowed the search to 1 out of those 5. The following article was chosen out of many others that met the criteria. It was by Liddon et al., 2014, Servant Leadership and Serving Culture, Influence of Individual and Unit Performance. This slide shows that the alternative article is more recent, and that its authors have comparable academic foci and expertise. The 2 research articles are evaluated and compared on the basis of these criteria: research purpose, research philosophy, research design, variables, external validity, internal validity, geographical representations, findings, and conclusions. Purpose statements. In one purpose statement, Melcher and Bosco said that they would investigate whether servant leadership helps develop a culture of servant leaders. The study focused on this purpose. On the other purpose statement, they said that they would examine the how of servant leadership instead of what. However, they did not test a hypothesis or perform statistical analysis to know the mechanics or factors that help a culture of servant leadership to emerge. Lydon et al. Stated purposes were consistent with the focus of the study: to develop and test a model to show that servant leadership generates a servant leadership culture, how servant leadership promotes positive outcomes, and how individual employee responses to servant leadership create organizational impacts. In terms of philosophy, both studies have positive epistemology and an objectivist ontology. They both have value-free orientation of axiology. They collect data from real-world organizations. Participants are actual employees. Both studies conduct empirical observations and statistical analysis to understand human behavior, making them positivist, objectivist, and value-free researchers. The study by Melcher and Bosco has weak positivism. His literature review is thin. Research purposes are partially fulfilled. Participants are drawn from an accessible sample. Inferences are drawn from a small sample and low response rate. No effort is made to reduce the single source bias. The inference that servant leadership sustains organizations in uncertain environments is drawn without adequate effort to understand the mechanism or moderating factors that bring about that result. The study has weak external validity or generalizability. It has weak internal validity due to weakness of research design, reducing its trustworthiness and meaningfulness. In terms of axiology, the study is not entirely objective and value-free, even though the authors employed statistical analysis to eliminate bias. In contrast, the multi-level, individual level, and store level study by Lydon et al. Has strong positivism. Purpose statements are well constructed and followed. Literature review is more extensive. The main hypothesis is drawn from literature search, social identity theory. The sample size is large. The response rate is high. Several statistical tests such as confirmatory and exploratory factor analyses are performed to test strength of the constructs in variables. Efforts are made to reduce single source bias. 5 sources of data are used. Greater generalizability and a sound research methodology give this study stronger external and internal validity respectively. In terms of axiology, this study is more value-free. These are the hypotheses. Melcher and Bosco tested 2 hypotheses. Mid-level managers who report to servant leaders will exhibit above average levels of servant leadership characteristics themselves. There will be no difference in the observations of servant leadership characteristics according to workers' age, level of education, and years of experience. The first one is the major hypothesis. These are the 2 major hypotheses for Lydon et al. That store manager servant leadership is positively related to serving culture, and serving culture is positively related to store performance. The research design. The Melcher and Bosco study used a convenient sample of 3 similar auto companies with 59 respondents and only 27% response rate. Due to the low N, they conducted ANOVA to test for significance of organizational membership. They conducted a priori qualitative interviews to discover themes on leadership traits and compare these themes with literature before building the hypothesis. And they used in quantitative analysis, they used Barbuto and Wheeler's questionnaire to conduct managers and employees perception surveys concerning existence of 5 servant leader traits in employees of servant leaders and on a Likert scale. Lydon et al. Study had a better experimental design because of random sampling and other tests before hypothesis testing. They randomly selected restaurants from one chain. This was a large N study with 961 employee respondents and 71 manager respondents. The response rate was high, 71% and 93% respectively. They conducted more extensive literature review and derived their main hypothesis from social learning and social identity theories. Instead of focusing on several servant leadership traits, they focused on one key trait, employee identification with the organization, to find evidence that employees who report to a servant leader emulate and place others' needs above their own. That an SL culture emerges when employees observe servant leader traits and emulate. The process creates employee identification with the organization and a mediating factor that explains how a serving culture improves individuals and organizational performance. So this graphic from Melcher and Bosco shows the above mean level of servant leadership traits that were found among employees who reported to a servant leader. On the basis of this result, the authors declared that their main hypothesis was confirmed, that is, servant leaders turn followers into servant leaders themselves. This is a conceptual graphic of Liddon et al. It shows the mechanism by which servant leadership improves both the store level and individual level performance. It shows that specifically that servant leadership creates a serving culture which becomes the mediating factor to bring about four indicator changes in employees' behaviors, which are in-role employee performance, employee creativity, employee customer service behaviors, and employee turnover intentions. The results of Melcher and Bosco study supported the hypothesis that servant leaders help create servant leader behaviors in employees. The Liddon et al. Study found that a positive relationship exists between servant leadership and serving culture, which improves organizational performance. Serving culture increases employees' identification with the organization, which serves to improve individual performance. Both studies in the strength and weaknesses, we see that both studies use a cross-sectional design, which does not permit broad generalizability. Also, both studies focused on one type of industry, giving limited applicability of finding to other businesses. In the Melcher and Bosco study, apart from the questionable quality of data collection techniques such as lack of randomization and small sampling size, the authors assumed without any statistical tests and support that servant leader culture improves organizational performance. That is, their attributed causation, where it may only be a correlation. The Liddon et al. Study has a stronger experimental design, such as randomization, inclusion of data from 5 sources, multi-level modeling, aggregation of data from individuals to store level, high performance rate, large sample size, reduction of single source bias, physical separation of restaurants, reducing contact bias, and better internal and external validity, giving weight to findings. This study elicited stronger conviction. The servant leadership creates a serving culture that in turn improves individual and organizational performance. External and internal validity. Because of the weaker research design, as noted above, the Melcher and Bosco study has low internal validity. Because its generalizability is suspect, it has low external validity. The study by Liddon et al., in contrast, has stronger external and internal validity. The title and the tasks in the Melcher and Bosco article are not aligned. The title tells that organizational performance improves due to servant leadership. The study, however, investigates whether servant leadership generates servant leader culture. The inferential leap to organizational performance is unjustified. In the alternative article, Linden et al.'s article, the title and tasks are aligned, producing believability of findings. Here are my recommendations. Ms. May's finding is commendable. Her vision for the organization is a catalyst for progress. The article she found, together with the alternative article, impart confidence in the positive relationship between a serving culture and individual and organizational performance. However, as a cautionary note, neither of the articles provides evidence or a categorical evidence on whether the servant leadership model suits all organizations always. No indication emerges from either article that servant leadership sustains organization in uncertain times. There might be circumstances such as an emergency, a conflict, or a timely opportunity where centralized decision-making or transformational transactional leadership might work better. It is important, therefore, to conduct a systematic literature review, examine long-term impact of organizational change, and undertake feasibility studies before executing a full-scale organizational cultural shift. This slide is my references. Thank you very much for this opportunity to present my thoughts on servant leadership.